Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the FIA Group.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Empowering Plans. I'm going to be your co-host today. This is Philip Qualo, Compliance and Regulatory Affairs Consultant with the FIA Group. And of course, we have with us the legend, Pat the Man. Hey, Pat. None of this would have been possible without his technical skills, so we always appreciate Pat. And we have a special guest star host for you today. You may all recognize her. I'm going to give you a little teaser. She's the newest regular on our webinars, and she happens to be my boss, the Vice President of Consulting, Miss Kelly Dempsey. Yay!
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Phil.
Oh, of course. Thank you for joining us, Kelly. And I know we have an important topic to discuss today. And before we get into that, I just wanted to say, this was a topic that you brought to me. You had to bring it to my attention because it's something we're not hearing a lot about. But before I go into it, I know the way you had related to me, it was you referenced it as COVID long haulers. That's how our conversation has started. And of course, when I first heard that in our conversation, right away, my head went to truck driving. So the whole time we were having that conversation until you elaborated, I really thought you were talking about long haul truck driving. But it's actually a little different and actually a more serious issue. And specifically, what we're focusing on when you hear the term COVID-19 long haulers, we're talking about individuals who have been diagnosed or might have been diagnosed, or there's suspicion they possibly had COVID. However, the symptoms are persisting, whether it's up to 6 months and almost to a year. So, Kelly, if you want to share the story that you were telling me, referencing the COVID-19 long haulers.
Yes, definitely. I will say, I think we both got a good laugh when we finally realized that we weren't on the same page about who we were talking about. So yeah, long haulers are not truck drivers. They're just individuals who are unfortunately dealing with long-lasting symptoms and effects of COVID. So I actually have a lady that I had gone to college with. She was a sorority sister in college. And we now both currently serve on our sorority alumni board, which is why I'm so close to her and know her story. And, her story was just kind of very eye-opening to me because I have unfortunately known a lot of people that have, unfortunately contracted COVID through various different ways. And the symptoms are just, like we know, so differing from person to person. And her story has really just resonated with me and created my caution because she is a long hauler. She was diagnosed with COVID back in October. She's a home healthcare worker, so it's kind of not surprising that unfortunately she contracted it. And to this day, we are now, here we are, April 1st, April Fools, unfortunately, that she still cannot taste or smell. It's been literally 6 months that she has not been able to smell or taste her food, which is just terrifying to me. She also has very frequent migraines. She was diagnosed with having a lot of swelling on the brain. She's significantly fatigued and deals with exhaustion on a regular basis. She did also have to have her appendix out, which they have not necessarily 100% linked to COVID, but it seems like there might be a connection there for some individuals because there were 3 people in the ER that day with her that all had their appendix out and all had COVID. So that's kind of, an interesting thing that I haven't heard much about. So these symptoms persisted for her for months. And she was finally able earlier this year, I think it was middle of January, to finally connect with a doctor who actually diagnosed her with POTS syndrome. So it's postural tachycardia syndrome. It's a syndrome that can be associated with a lot of different medical things, but very recently it's obviously been linked to COVID. And more or less, long story short, in plain English, she can be sitting down and her resting heart rate between 60 and 70 beats per minute. And just from standing up, her heart rate can spike to 150 beats per minute. Most of us, it takes a good solid, 5 or 6 minutes of cardio workout to get to that heart rate. So the fact that just standing up can make your heart rate spike and make you feel woozy is a little terrifying. And she, as an individual, I want to say, a lot of people have associated severe COVID symptoms with individuals who have a lot of comorbidities. She doesn't have those. She was actually a fitness major in college, and she's literally one of the most healthy, physically fit people that I know. I envy her physical fitness, and she went from running miles a day to barely being able to walk a mile. She's still working up to being able to walk a mile without having to take a nap afterwards. So that was a lot, and it's kind of scary, and my intent is not to scare anybody here, but it's just the consideration that these people are out there and to bring attention and awareness to this. But the way it ties into the self-funding space, because I know that everybody's kind of wondering, why am I going on about this? There's a lot of plan and employer considerations here because there are impacts to benefits. So one of the things she's recently dealing with is that her employer has indicated that they have to change her status from full-time to on-call, and subsequently she is going to lose access to her short-term disability benefits, which are paid by her. So that was kind of startling to me, and it definitely begs the question of what are plans and employers doing here, because there are a lot of impacts here. There's impacts to the health plan and continuation of coverage. COBRA subsidies are obviously a new thing that has recently been issued, so that's going to play into it. And the concept of if an employer has to be measuring somebody to be on the health plan, how they are measuring an individual to stay on the plan with that employment change of status. Plus, there's all these other types of leave. She obviously took FMLA, and there's, other employer and state leaves and American with Disabilities Act leave. So there's all these things that play into each other, including disability. So Phil, I know that in a prior life, you had dealt a lot with short-term and long-term disability. So you've been able to kind of, at least in the past, examine that specific issue. So why don't you talk a little bit about the struggles you see with people potentially, or the potential struggles, since we haven't really gotten there, with disability and how that impacts what we're talking about.
Oh, definitely. And first, I want to say, after I realized that it wasn't a long hauler didn't mean truck driving. I did some research on this, and there's not a lot of information out there. I also want to say I wish your friend a speedy recovery. I know it's been some time, but it's got to be difficult because there are no treatment options even for COVID. So how do you treat long haulers when there's not even an approved treatment yet for COVID? We've been focused on prevention and vaccine, but bringing it back to the disability, the more I learned about it, it seems like the one thing that is lacking here, which can really impact even private disability plans, including short-term disability, long-term disability, as well as Social Security disability, is there is no clear diagnosis for these conditions. I know in the situation of your friend, there was a diagnosis eventually. However, they're still not sure how they got there. It sounds like, this is most likely linked to COVID, but in her situation, I know this doesn't sound right, but it's fortunate she was able to find a physician that was able to find a diagnosis, because here's what's challenging. Being in the disability sector for some time, I can tell you the first thing I was looking for when a claim came in, and especially if I was looking at appeal, is what is the diagnosis? Show me the objective evidence. These are things that cannot really be tested, because even just hearing from you about your friend's symptoms, usually in the medical realm, that's considered subjective. Fatigue, I'm tired. Now, the heart rate obviously was something that could be measured, but these symptoms are manifesting differently for everyone. I remember Alyssa Milano was on, is it Twitter or YouTube, showing her hair was falling. So there's just no clear guidance here or any kind of studies that really allow any kind of physician who's dealing with the situation or an individual to make a clear diagnosis and put together any kind of objective limitations based on these symptoms. So the result is it's more than likely, without any kind of diagnosis, that benefits are going to be denied.
You're totally right. And I don't mean to slow your roll there, but yeah, it took her months to be able to connect with a doctor that was actually able to diagnose her with POTS. She did actually also suffer some hair loss too. So that's, again, another kind of terrifying link to all these things. But you're right. She was ill and having these symptoms for over 4 months before she was finally connected with a doctor to give her this secondary diagnosis and get her on a path to treatment to trying to recover from that. This is another one of those syndromes that there's no clear end or start date. It's just the result of a lot of viruses. You can get this syndrome, and whether or not it can ever go away or just be maintained and well controlled is kind of still, one of those medical mysteries. So it's kind of terrifying. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, definitely. And it just kind of goes into what we're discussing here. And it's basically that in the beginning, let's face it, there weren't enough tests. There wasn't enough testing. I know at least several people who had contracted COVID in the beginning who would call, because testing was so scarce in the beginning, would call their doctor. And if they just had certain symptoms, the doctor wanted to be safe and just said, okay, you have COVID, don't leave your home for 2 weeks. But especially for the individuals and, of course, being on the front line, healthcare worker or even healthcare aide, I consider that being on the front line, who might have caught that earlier, might not have been tested right away for this. Maybe they didn't demonstrate symptoms, in the beginning. What makes that even worse for disability filing is that if you don't even have a diagnosis of COVID, it's even harder now because all you can do is get tested for the antibodies. You know what I mean? Because we don't know enough about COVID, that isn't enough. The antibody test is not enough to support limitations and restrictions for these COVID-19 long haulers. So it's even worse when you don't have a documented COVID-19 diagnosis. And even with that, again, there's no definitive answers on this, but the impressions we've been getting from, 2 weeks quarantine, 14 days, at least the impression I had this first started is like, oh, okay, obviously this is a very serious condition, but if you did contract it, it's about 2 or 3 weeks. We're not getting that information about the long haulers or that this could possibly be long term. And as you noted, it's because not enough time has passed yet. But even beyond disability benefits, one thing that is also an obstacle, depending how a self-funded plan is customized, is seeking treatment. Because there is no treatment options, as we noted. There was a medication that they were trying to use for COVID at one point. Was it Remdesivir? Can't remember how it was pronounced.
I'm not sure if I know the correct pronunciation because I feel like I say it wrong, but yeah, you're
Close enough. It starts with an R. And I know some plans were not covering that because it's, first of all, if there's an exclusion for off-label use of medication, which, we do see in some plans, Remdesivir was not approved for COVID-19 treatment. It's an experiment. And that goes into another exclusion that might be in a plan. Again, we haven't really focused on treatment. It's been prevention and vaccine. So any kind of serious treatment could be considered experimental or investigational, which is a very common exclusion in self-funded plans. I think a clear example of that is when they were trying to use kidney dialysis as a form of treatment for Ebola during that outbreak. And in that situation, a lot of plans, we all know dialysis is expensive. A lot of well-meaning plans with their exclusions, because you got to be careful with stop loss, had to deny these kind of claims. So it presents a lot of challenges, not only in applying for disability benefits, but especially in the case of your friends, even getting treatment. And especially with limitations in a plan, that could be even more difficult.
Right. I haven't even talked to her about maybe her health benefits because honestly, I'm not 100% certain she has health benefits through her employer, but there's definitely so many considerations here. And, the focus in the last, especially 6 months, has been the vaccine and prevention of COVID and, the changing regulations about, like you said, about how long somebody needs to stay home and this, that, the next thing. So there's been a heavy focus there and not necessarily a lot of talk about these long haulers and individuals who may carry these symptoms for a very, very long time. So I'd like to start hearing more about it, but I think it's going to be one of those things that depends on who gets a hold of the story and enough doctors that have all those brilliant minds getting together to bring things to light and put them in the spotlight. And, it is, again, we're at a little over a year, so maybe we don't have enough in that group to consider long haulers. I don't know. I feel like they're out there and maybe their stories just aren't being heard. But anyway, to link it back to employee benefits again, there are individuals on the health plans that we deal with on a daily basis. So it's very likely that the TPAs we work with and the stop loss carriers we work with are going to see these individuals and have these claims issues at some point in time, whether they know it or not. And, connecting the dots can be very difficult and very hard. And then there's the interaction of the plan language and medical necessity and experimental investigational. Then you add the next layer of stop loss and whether or not stop loss is going to be reimbursed if they have a different definition of experimental investigational or medical necessity. That's always a curveball that might be out there. So, now is the time for these employers and plans to start looking at things and looking at their processes and procedures related to individuals that maybe need additional time off and they want to keep them employed, but they need to make sure they have all their leaves of absences in order, not only compliant, but just documented correctly in their handbook or however they document their procedures, and make sure that their plan language obviously corresponds to those procedures as well, however the employer wants to handle it. So, aside from compliance and what they're required to do, what do they want to do? How long do they want to keep these individuals on the plan? Because outside of FMLA, there's not necessarily a lot of leaves that require a continuation of coverage. So, the Americans with Disabilities Act, I know I've talked about this before and I've written about it, that the Americans with Disabilities Act does not actually require a continuation of health plan coverage when an employer has to offer a leave of absence as a reasonable accommodation. So that's some place that we've seen employers take a sidestep. So it's something definitely to consider here as these individuals, are fighting this potential disability battle because, they want to work. My friend desperately wants to return to work. She just physically cannot do it because she needs to be able to travel. And with the constant fatigue and the sensitivity to light that causes her to have massive migraines, it's just not safe for her to do so. It's a liability. So, unfortunately, the lawyer thing that I'm going to end with is that these types of situations and how to apply existing procedures and plan language will very much be a case-by-case basis that you'll have to look at. And obviously, we're here to help with these types of things, but now's the time to start planning. We try to be proactive instead of reactive. So be proactive, look at your plan language, look at your policies, look at the stop loss policies, look at all those procedures and try to determine what you have in place and what is available so that these individuals know what's coming when you do have them arise and that there's no surprises from an employer perspective either. So with that, thank you so much for joining Phil and I today on this podcast. Again, hopefully it wasn't too heavy and again, not trying to be too scary, just trying to bring light to some other stories that we're starting to see that have the potential to be a very real impact on the self-funded industry. I hope everybody has a wonderful April. Spring is hopefully coming for everybody. And thank you again for listening.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you for educating us about this. It's a very important topic, and I'm sure we're going to be hearing more about it in the months to come. Thank you again. Happy April, everyone.